So now I'm going to introduce our speaker, who is Scott Seligman. And a number of you I know have already come up and spoken to him and have various connections to him. He's here today to talk about the Great Christmas Boycott of 1906, a fascinating book about Jewish children in New York public schools. Here it is. I've read it, and I highly recommend it. He will tell you about the book, so I'm not going to tell you about it, but I want to make sure that you know that this is only one of 12 books that Scott has written. Several have Jewish themes, such as the Great Kosher Meat War of 1902 and the Chief Rabbi's Funeral. Scott is also fluent in Chinese, and some of his books focus on Chinese themes. In addition, he's written many articles for a wide range of magazines and journals. One question I know I have for Scott is how he juggles these various topics that he has tackled. But for now, I'll turn things over to Scott and let him tell you about the Great Christmas Boycott.
We're all set. Oh, okay, good. Great. Yeah. Let's get the notes ready. Well, good afternoon. I want to thank Rita. I want to thank Sylvia. I want to thank Sarah Brown, and I especially want to thank Jerry for the giving me parking spot number 1 this afternoon. In fact, I was wondering, I was going to ask her if I join the shul, do I get to keep the spot? And then she told me, no, it belongs to the rabbi. And so I figured I would lose in that particular battle. Anyway, the book I'm going to talk about today, The Great Christmas Boycott, it can loosely be considered the third book in a trilogy. All of them are set in New York City at the turn of the 20th century. All of them center mostly on the Russian and Eastern European Jewish community, and all of them concern struggles of that community and the ways that they were resolved. So the first of the trilogy, this is the third. Oops, we didn't switch. I'll just use this. No, it's not switching. And you told me we were ready.
I thought we were ready. Huh. That is peculiar.
Are we frozen?
Maybe it just froze.
Yeah. Okay, here we go.
There we go. Okay, and this should work now.
Yeah, that works too then.
Fantastic.
Great, thanks. The first was a book called The Great Kosher Meat War of 1902. And that tells the story of Jewish women, primarily this was a woman's story, on the Lower East Side, who had to take to the streets to protest the rising prices of kosher meat that put it out of the reach of many of the families. These were women with their backs against the wall. They kept kosher homes. They couldn't afford kosher meat, and they couldn't buy non-kosher meat. And it turns out the prices had been manipulated, and they suspected as much. But there was rioting on the Lower East Side, and this is generally thought to mark the dawn of Jewish female activism in the United States, or political activism, or consumer activism. The one that followed that, just a few months later, actually, whoops, here we are, was called The Chief Rabbi's Funeral. And it's set in the same place, like I say, just a couple of weeks after it. It tells the story of the death of the chief rabbi and his funeral, which gave rise to what was then and is still, as far as we know, the single largest anti-Semitic riot in American history. And I didn't intend for that book to be timely when I wrote it, but these things sort of have a way of coming back at you. And this work, The Great Christmas Boycott, it tells the story of the entry of the Jewish community into the debate about religion, and in particular Christmas celebrations in the public schools. Another one that became timely somehow with what's going on with Christian nationalism today. Now, I'm not a native New Yorker, but I'm close. I'm a nice Jewish boy born in Newark, New Jersey. And I grew up in the same neighborhood as Philip Roth. He was older than I was. I didn't know him. Weequahic High School. I was one of the last Jewish boys to graduate from Weequahic High School, as a matter of fact. And had his English teacher. But I don't pretend to the achievements of Philip Roth. And I went to Maple Avenue School, which was so overwhelmingly Jewish at the time that students and teachers, that the Board of Education could barely keep it open on the high holidays. In fact, my parents had a couple of friends who were, neither of whom were Jewish, a man and a woman, a couple, that met at Weequahic High School, excuse me, at Maple Avenue School, on the Jewish holidays because they were among the 3 kids who showed up that day. And here I am about 8 years of age. I think that was Mrs. Cohen's class, but it might have been Mrs. Heistine. I honestly don't remember. Well, although I am now well into my 70s, I can still recite the 23rd Psalm that I learned as a child at Maple Avenue School, King James Version, verbatim. The text was drilled into me by actually Gentile and Jewish teachers. They had to. State law in New Jersey from 1903 required the daily reading of at least 5 verses from the Old Testament in the public schools. Now, never mind the fact that in my Hebrew school, they never would have ventured within 100 yards of that Church of England translation. Still, that was what we learned. And to this day, you know, there are things, I don't remember what I had for breakfast yesterday, but I know the 23rd Psalm, King James Version. That's just the way it works. Well, friends of mine who grew up across the Hudson River and were products of the New York City public school system actually have very different memories. None of them remembers Bible reading. And that's why, Alan, I thought it was very interesting when you were telling me over lunch that you do remember that from the New York schools. None of the ones I talked to did. But they did have vague memories of daily recitation of something called the Regent's Prayer, which was an ostensibly non-denominational prayer appeal to God for blessings. It was actually written by the Board of Regents in New York City. And parenthetically, that was the prayer that was at the heart of the Engel versus Vitale case in the 1962 Supreme Court decision that threw school prayer out of schools entirely. It was that prayer. So why the difference between New York and New Jersey? Well, in the course of researching the book, I learned that the states and even individual communities within the states often went very separate ways on the question of how much or what religion was actually allowed in the public schools. And you could trace the seeds of those arrangements back to decades earlier, sometimes the beginning of the century, variously by state legislatures, by governors, by courts, by boards of education, and even by principals, school principals. In the case of New York, whose Jews had a plea for secularism in the schools fall on deaf ears in 1906, or 1905, 1906. It was due in part to a citywide boycott that they organized on the day of the school Christmas pageants in 1906. And this little remembered act of civil disobedience is the main subject of the book. And the book actually goes on to trace the history of this dispute to the present day. And I'll be happy to talk about that in the Q&A section, but I wanted to focus the formal part of the talk just on what happened back in 1906. It bothered me as a kid that we were being taught to pray like Christians. And it has always bothered me that Christmas is a legal holiday in the United States, which has an establishment clause in its constitution. I'm not anti-Christmas. I love the songs. I love visiting friends. I've always had Christmas tree envy from my non-Jewish friends. And I love the Christmas carols, but I've just never thought that the public schools were an appropriate venue for this. And so when I happened on this event, I knew it was something I really wanted to write about. So return with me now to those thrilling days of yesteryear. Whoops. Wait a minute, did I miss something here? I missed something. Hang on, I missed a couple of things here. Excuse me. After the Bible reading, why is this moving by itself? Help. Honestly, I didn't do anything.
Oh, and then we'll just skip.
Okay. All right, there we go.
Yeah.
After the prayer, after the Bible reading was the Lord's Prayer. Again, something else that you don't find in the Jewish tradition because it comes right out of the New Testament, but I can recite that and probably many of you can as well, I would think. Okay, so in New York, this Regent's Prayer, I know what happened. I just got backed up on the slides. We talked about the Regent's Prayer. Now we'll catch up. Here we go. Thrilling days of yesteryear. This is Brownsville. In 1905, Brownsville, Brooklyn, rather like my native Newark, New Jersey, was overwhelmingly Jewish. And they were Jews, some who came directly from Europe, most of them came from the Lower East Side. And after the construction of the Brooklyn Bridge in 1888 made it more easily accessible, a lot of Jews moved over to Brooklyn. And this community was overwhelmingly Jewish at the turn of the century. And the story really begins at PS 144, which had opened just the year before. There were so many immigrants, there's so many Jewish immigrants in particular that were flooding New York that they couldn't keep up with school construction. There were something like 6 schools were added just in Brooklyn, just in the previous year, and this was one of them. It had only been open for a year. It was kindergarten through 8th grade. And like Brownsville itself, the vast majority of its 2,400 students were Jews. But the principal wasn't. He was a man named Frank Harding. And he was a devout Presbyterian. And he called an assembly in the middle of December of 1905 when preparations were being made for the holiday season. And he believed so deeply in the redemptive power of Jesus Christ that he decided that his Savior's message would be beneficial to people who might not have heard it, like his students. And so he began reading aloud from a book called Gems of Wisdom from Bible, Literature, and Proverbs. It was pretty heavily New Testament, but there was some Old Testament in it as well. And I did some research just on the book itself. The man who wrote it took care to make it the sort of book that would not be offensive to anybody. But I read it. I took offense to several of the verses. And after he quoted from Gems of Wisdom, he told the students that he wanted them all to be like Jesus Christ. And the quote went something like, "Christ blesses all but the hypocrites. And the hypocrites are the people who do not believe in him. He forgives all but those. So boys and girls, I want you to be like Christ." And this is pretty much a version. There were so many different reports of this that this is pretty much what he said, even though he kind of denied it later. Well, those remarks did not sit well with a 14-year-old girl named Gussie Herbert, who was a 7th grader, observant. She had gone to religious classes. Not all the kids had, but she had, and she knew something about her Jewish heritage. And she just didn't think that she was a hypocrite. And so she screwed up her courage. She advanced to the front of the room and she asked him very politely, but in a way everybody could hear her, why he thought it was proper to preach the Christian religion in a public school. Well, Harding denied that he was preaching, and then he immediately contradicted himself, and he said, "Anybody whom preaching on Christ does not suit may have the pleasure of leaving the room at any time." And then he ordered her back to her seat. Well, Gussie got flack from a couple of Christian boys on the way home. They called her a Christ killer. One of them spat in her face. They also called her a sheenie, which is a term that I only know because my grandmother taught it to me. Someone had called her that in Newark when she was growing up. Fortunately, it's one of the terms you don't hear anymore. You know, it's gone, and that's a good thing. So at dinner that evening, I don't have a picture of Gussie. I found her grandson, and I wrote him several letters, but he kind of ghosted me. So I don't have a picture of her, but I do have a picture of her father. He was a prominent attorney, and she told him the whole story. He was enraged by it, but he was not surprised by it. And he knew just who to contact about it. Enter Albert Lucas. Albert Lucas was at that point the secretary of the Union of Orthodox Jewish Congregations. That's the Orthodox Union that we know today, the people who who decide what's kosher and what's not kosher. It had only had a few years history at this point. I think it was 1898 that it was started. And Lucas, as it turned out, was kind of lying in wait for something like this to happen. He knew it was going to happen and he was waiting for it. He was fresh from doing battle with the settlement houses. The Christian settlement houses that have been set up in the Lower East Side provided services to all the communities. It wasn't just the Jews. They provided services that were very important to immigrants that had no resources at all, but they were not above using them as a vector for proselytizing. And Lucas was very much against that. He believed that he began to believe, and I'll tell you a little bit more about that. He had been in correspondence with Jacob Riis, which is maybe a name that you know. He's the guy that wrote that book called How the Other Half Lives. He was a photojournalist, among other things. He was also a missionary. He's Danish American. And it had been reported that the Jacob Riis settlement, which had taken his name, had been actively working on converting children. And Lucas wrote him a letter, and as he said, I don't want to accuse you of anything until I know if it's true. Would you answer me? And Riis wrote him a letter, and he said, absolutely. He said, if you're not educating your kids in Judaism, they're fair game as far as we're concerned. So he was kind of sometimes he was a philo-Semite, sometimes he was an anti-Semite. He was a difficult to understand kind of a guy. But Lucas believed that his role in life was to make the world safe for Jews. Make the country safe for Jews. And that's what he was trying to do here. So it was a short hop from believing that the settlement houses were trying to convert the Jewish kids to trying to getting to the point where he believed that the public schools were doing the same thing. And so after Harding's discussion in the assembly, which really started all of this, the local Jewish community circulated a petition calling for Harding's dismissal. And the way it worked was there was a local board of education. There were several local boards of education in neighborhoods in Brooklyn, and they all reported centrally to the big board of education in Manhattan. But the petition was correctly addressed to one of the local boards, which actually had a Jew in charge of the committee that wound up hearing it. The local board of education, they finally got around to holding a hearing. Parenthetically, the Jewish head of this committee originally scheduled it for Saturday. And he was a German Jew. He was, I'm sure, a Reformed Jew. When Lucas approached him and said, "What are you, nuts?" He said, "Well, Jews go to theater on Saturday. Why can't they go to a hearing on Saturday?" And eventually it became Wednesday. He got religion as far as that was concerned. There were a couple of sessions that he chaired. He was not very good at it. And students and teachers testified. Gussie Herbert testified. She was booed by some of the claque that the principal had arranged to be at the hearing. And ultimately, the local board declined to recommend any sanctions against Harding. But they were not the final authority. The final authority was the Board of Education in Manhattan. And there it went to the Committee on Elementary Education, chaired by a Jewish man, Abraham Stern. And some people thought this was a good omen. They were going to get a hearing now from a Jewish guy in charge of the Elementary Education Committee. But they soon discovered that Stern was a different sort of a Jew. He was one of the uptown Jews. I don't know how much you know about New York Judaism or Jewish history, but these were the Jews of German extraction. There were some Sephardim there too, but most of them were German. They had come from Europe earlier, mid-century. Many of them had prospered and assimilated, and they were living uptown. They were not living on the Lower East Side, even though I think they started out there. And people like him were somewhat embarrassed by these later arriving Russian and Eastern European Jews. They recognized that they were kin and that they were brethren, and they did certain things to help them along. They actually set up some settlement houses of their own to Americanize them. But it was also, they had selfish motives as well, because to the extent that these people could be Americanized, they weren't going to be an embarrassment. The Russian and Eastern European Jews, they were different from the Germans from the get-go. These were people who lived their Judaism 24/7. And a lot of them who came, they really weren't very interested in assimilating. Maybe their kids were, but they just wanted freedom from Russia and from Austria, wherever they were. They were perfectly content to live very Jewish, Yiddish-oriented lives in the Lower East Side, which was embarrassing to these established German Jews who had achieved a certain measure of acceptance from Gentile New York and who didn't really want to be associated with these guys downtown. Now, apparently, I think the feeling was pretty mutual. I think when the Russian Jews went uptown, if they did, and walked into a Reformed temple, and they saw men and women sitting together, and no kippot, and no shaitels, and no women up in the balcony, and organs, they thought they were in churches. I mean, they really didn't get it. And so it turns out that this guy, Abraham Stern, was a German Jew who was not sympathetic to this argument about Christmas in the public schools. He just didn't think that it was that big a deal. He was a member of what they called the Harmony Club, still exists in New York, which had gotten its start in the mid-19th century as the Gesellschaft Harmonie. The language was German up until the very end of the 19th century. And the unofficial motto of the Harmony Club was more Polish and less Polish. And he just didn't see anything harmful in this. But the committee, to his credit, I guess, they did record their disapproval of what Frank Harding had done. And they recommended it to the full board, and the full board concurred. Basically, it was a slap on the wrist. There were really no consequences for Harding except that he lost the case. Now, the truth is, Lucas and company were wrong here. There was no conspiracy on the part of the New York Board of Education to make kids Christian. But that didn't mean that other people didn't have that idea and that it was a kind of a popular idea in some ways. So this and the next 4 slides are illustrations from a magazine called Frank Leslie's Weekly. It was a popular illustrated large format news publication, had tens of thousands of subscribers. Think of it as the Life magazine of 1905, and you can't go too far wrong. And they actually show a step-by-step how-to guide to indoctrinating non-Christian children with the, quote, symbols and joys of Christmas. And the article asserted that the joy and gift-giving of the Christmas season was the best way to improve the homes of the immigrants. And it was illustrated with a full page of photos, which I'll show you in a second, of Lower East Side children over the caption, "Benighted children taught to celebrate Christmas." Well, we were the benighted children. The youngsters were never specifically identified as Jews in the article, but it was pretty clear who the benighted children were because the Christian immigrant children, they didn't need any introduction to Christmas. We were the ones who did. So they showed you the children starting out to line up to get the Christmas tree and carrying the tree back into the school and admiring the loads of gifts under the tree, and finally enjoying the new and novel toys that have been allotted to them. So there very much were people that thought that the schools were a Christianizing influence, but I think Lucas was probably wrong to ascribe this motive to the Board of Education. I don't think that was what was going on. Well, the board censured, or let's say slapped Harding on the wrist. But what it did not do was address any of the larger issues. And, this is by the way, this is the committee of the board, that's Stern's committee. Lucas wanted to hold them to account for this. It was one thing to decide on what's going to happen to Frank Harding. And in fact, by the time that any justice was delivered to Harding, the Jews no longer wanted him fired. They really just wanted him to know that he shouldn't do that again. He was eventually transferred to a non-Jewish section of Brooklyn. But what Lucas wanted the board to do, and what he wanted to know was what was and wasn't allowed in the schools. Harding had read the Lord's Prayer. Was that allowed? He had allowed Christmas trees and images of Jesus in the public schools. Was that allowed? And the Madonna. And what about Christmas songs? Were Christmas songs allowed? And so he followed up to ask the board for some guidelines and to make sure that, and his goal was to make sure this didn't happen again. That's really where he was. And the board committee, to its credit, agreed that it would hear from the Jewish community before it made any decisions or recommendations. And Lucas assembled a delegation of about 24 prominent Jews, including Orthodox and Reform rabbis. And I got to tell you, that must have been really hard for him because he was deeply anti-reform. It was the Orthodox Union. I mean, that's where he worked. He wanted to make it clear to the board that the Orthodox and the Reformed Jewish establishments were of one mind on this issue. There was no daylight here. Nobody wanted Christmas in the public schools. And each of the rabbis who spoke took a different tack in explaining why Christianity had no place in the public schools, why it was harmful to Jewish children. One rabbi told the story of his daughter being asked to write a composition on Jesus, and he didn't think that was appropriate. And they approached it from different angles. They were all very respectful and they were very good. And so the Board of Education was torn. If they abolished Christmas exercises entirely, they would incur the enmity of Christians. And as we will see, that was an important factor. But allowing them would enrage the Jews. So despite the fact that this had taken most of a year to get through this, Christmas 1906 was now coming up. And they did what deliberative bodies the world over always do when they're divided. They did nothing, which meant that it was going to be business as usual at the public schools for Christmas 1906, with the principals pretty much free to do as they pleased. Well, that was the last straw for Lucas and company. And it was time to raise the stakes. So after the students were told that they should come to school on December 24th in their best clothes to take part in Christmas pageants, and that despite requests launched by the Jewish community, Jewish children would not be excused from these exercises, calls for a boycott appeared in the Yiddish newspapers, and that's what this is. Don't send your children to school on Monday. You don't want to hear me read it in Yiddish, it's not pretty. And mothers dutifully kept their kids home. Some schools were more effective than others. And how successful the boycott was in keeping children out of school kind of depended on which newspapers you read. So you had the New York Times, which estimated that in the Lower East Side, something like 25,000 children, which is about 1/3 of the school population, stayed home. But the Yiddish papers, the Wahrheit and the Tageblatt, they reported that many schools were largely empty on the Lower East Side, and that in Brooklyn, the absentee rate was somewhere between 50 and 75%. And there was some debate, even within the Jewish community, as to whether the boycott had been much of a success. It was only a one-day deal. For one thing, some schools really hadn't needed boycotting in the first place. The principals had already gotten the message, and they'd either taken as much religion as they could out of the celebrations, or they eliminated them entirely. But they were boycotted like everybody else was. But the Jews had made their point, and their action alarmed the Board of Education. The Committee on Elementary Schools, Stern's committee, finally submitted some recommendations, and they really were a compromise. The Jews won on 2 points, and they lost on 2 points. Sectarian hymns would no longer be permitted, nor would compositions be assigned on religious subjects. But Christmas trees, they were okay. Holly was okay. Mistletoe was fine. And they would continue to be allowed, as would religious imagery. They took no position on whether it was okay for the Madonna's picture to be in the schools. But as you might guess, the board's concessions generated enormous anti-Semitic public backlash in the press. Now, here's a sampling of letters from the Brooklyn Daily Eagle, which itself was not sympathetic from the very beginning to this whole action on the part of the Jews. Here's some quotes. It's an insult to the Christian parents in this city and to their children. It's an insult to the God of Abraham, the Father of our Lord and the Savior, Jesus Christ. Well, I kind of get how it could be an insult to the Father of our Lord and the Savior. I don't think they get Abraham, but they did. Has it got to the point where all our American institutions have got to fall in line with the Jews and Jewish ideas? If they don't care to have their children hear the Christmas carols, let them keep them home. And my personal favorite, under these circumstances, it would be more becoming the Jew if he would show his appreciation of the favors extended to him and cease from interfering with the religious beliefs and institutions of the majority of the citizens of a country where he has found an asylum. You could almost hear this today from the Christian nationalists. So what was most appalling about this outcry were the underlying assumptions that Jews were either not true Americans or were somehow lesser Americans, latecomers that were tolerated by the Christians who got here first. That Jews should be grateful for the asylum that was granted them out of the goodness of Christian hearts, that they should be happy they weren't in Russia anymore, and they shouldn't make waves. That if anti-Semitic, and this one you'll hear forever, if anti-Semitism increased as a result of the Jewish protest, the Jews would have only themselves to blame. Well, what was sad about it was that none of the critics gave serious consideration to the basic question of principle that Lucas was trying to raise. Were the public schools an appropriate or even a legal venue for Christmas celebrations? And they insisted on viewing the whole affair as a Hebrew attack on Christmas and Christians and a Jewish conspiracy to deprive Christian children of their legitimate rights, as if there was a legitimate right to have Jesus in the public schools. And they accused Jews of trying to secularize, or in some versions of it, to Judaize the entire country. Well, when the Board of Education saw the reaction, you might guess, they backtracked. They pretended they hadn't abolished sectarian hymns at all. And they washed their hands of the whole matter and more or less dumped it in the laps of the school principals. It was a real profile in courage, I got to tell you. And it remained with the principals pretty much after that for most of the 20th century. In the end, there were recriminations, mostly against Albert Lucas. Whoops, sorry. What did I do here? Oh, come on. There we go. Lucas had spearheaded an effort that had yielded fairly paltry results. And a lot of people said, why did you do this in the first place if this was all we were going to get out of it? All you did was piss off the Christians. But for better or worse, Lucas did make the concerns of local Jews impossible to ignore. And had it not been for his activism, it's very doubtful anybody in authority would have given this issue a second thought. He put it on the map. The truth is, banishing Christmas celebrations from the schools entirely, despite the strong legal arguments for it, was a fool's errand. It wasn't going to happen. No matter how much Lucas and company wanted to fight a battle over the law, the outcome was always going to be decided by politics. And since there was never going to be much public support for it, that pretty much guaranteed that the elected officials were not going to support it. Ridding public schools of Christian influences was an issue that always had a better chance in the courts than it ever did in the administration. And basically because it involved defending the rights of minorities, and that's not necessarily popular. Well, that's not the end of the story. It's all I want to tell about today in the formal presentation, but the book goes on to look at how the courts handled religion in the schools in subsequent years. I actually trace it to the present day, and how the logical heirs to Lucas's crusade, which are the national Jewish organizations, the ADL, the American Jewish Committee, American Jewish Congress, all of which were formed after this, after 1906, how they have dealt with Christmas in the schools up to the point where today, I'm arguing that they have mostly declined to continue this fight, and that they have moved on to other more winnable fights against Christian nationalism because this one's a loser. And now I would be happy to take questions. I also suspect that some of you are going to have stories to share of your own about prayer in the public schools and things like that. But most of it, I'm looking at the generation out here. We all probably, most of us remember prayer in the schools and Bible reading and stuff and how we felt about it. Okay.
We're all set.
Okay. Or you can just signal Sid if you want to. Anybody got a question? Here we are. Rita.
Well, I raised this issue in my introduction to you. I was sort of awed at the number of different topics that you cover in your research and how you keep them all straight, because they're not all Jewish themed and they're not all, how do you do it?
Well, I'll tell you about my research process if you want to know.
That's what I want to know.
First of all, I am fortunate to live when I live and not 20 or 30 or 40 years earlier to be writing. So much of the material that I used in this book is available on the internet that I can do most of the research sitting on my butt in my study. And that's really different from when we were kids and we went to the library and we went to the Reader's Guide for periodical literature and hoped that when we got the microfilm out and we got dizzy going through the microfilm reader, that we would find the article that we were looking for. And we are worlds away from that with the advent of the internet, with the advent of optical character recognition, and with the advent of keyword search. I can now decide on a topic that I'm interested in, or even before I've decided on it, just explore a topic. I can go to any of a number of websites. The Library of Congress has a site called Chronicling America that's only old newspapers. That's all it is. And some of them are free sites and some of them are pay sites. And I can put in some keywords and I will get results back, some of which I was looking for, many of which I had no idea I was looking for. But within a week of deciding on a topic, I can probably have 1,500 articles on my computer about it. And that's really different from the old days. That's number one. Number two, if you're researching Jewish topics, the National Library of Israel has a wonderful free website with historic Jewish newspapers of all languages: Spanish, English, Ladino, Yiddish. And with modern AI technology, you can even get a pretty decent translation of a Yiddish article by machine. With you can actually send up one of these PDFs to an AI site, and you'll get a flawed, but you get a pretty good idea of what the article is about just by doing that. So there's all of that. Some of the stuff you still need an archive for. You know, if it's a court case, it's probably never going to get digitized and put on the web because not that many people are interested in it. But you can write for records, or you can go to archives and do searches. For the latest book I'm working on right now, I'm going to have to camp out at the National Archives in College Park for probably several days just to do the research. But what this has also done for me is that it's been able to speed up my process. I don't have to spend 6 months or 8 months running around to archives and doing research. I can do so much of it so quickly on the internet. And so that's a good deal of it. I have a system where I download an article and I label the way I label it, it automatically becomes chronological when I put it in a folder. So I can literally go down the chronology and figure out who did what to whom when, which also makes things much easier. Now, AI is intruding on all of this territory, and sometimes I have to watch myself. I mean, I'll never let AI write a sentence of my books. That's off the table as far as I'm concerned. But it's a pretty damn good researcher. I think of it as, if you use it as Google on steroids, it's wonderful. It can bring you all sorts of information, but it's also often, I think they call it hallucinations. It often has hallucinations. I'll just tell you a quick story. I was looking for a topic, and I asked it for interesting stories about turn of the century Jewish figures. And it gave me one that was really tantalizing to me. It was about, what's her name? The woman who wrote the poem on the Statue of Liberty. Emma Lazarus, thank you. A Sephardic Jew. Emma Lazarus, according to grok.com, was very upset by the Kishinev pogrom in 1903 in Russia, so much so that she traveled to Odessa, chartered a ship for 80-some orphans who were orphaned by this particular pogrom to sail for the United States, that she stood on the deck with a gun as the Russian torpedo boats followed them. They went through the Strait of Gibraltar, the mast fell, and the children sang Hatikva. They got to Galveston. Jacob Schiff provided the guarantee so even the kids with conjunctivitis could get into the United States. So I stopped for a minute. I went back to Google and I checked with Emma Lazarus. And sure enough, she was dead 14 years before this damn pogrom happened. The entire story was made up, every damn bit of it. They offered me the manifest with the names of the children. And sure enough, they were, Yitzchak ben Moshe on it. No surnames, but, and so I said to them after I discovered the fraud, I said, where did you get this? Well, we conflated different manifests from the same period and we came up with this list. Well, there weren't 86 orphans from the damn Kishinev pogrom in the first place. The ship that they named was an Israeli ship from the 1970s. Every damn last bit of it was wrong. And it was an object lesson for me. You can't believe anything they give you without double checking it. But that being said, if you demand sources, and by the way, the sources they give you sometimes don't say what they said they said. But if you demand sources, then it really can point you in some very, very interesting directions. So did that go enough to Rita to answer the question? Yes. Your microphone's coming.
Who? Okay,
Yeah.
hold him.
We'll do the next, okay?
Let's give our names so Scott knows who he's talking to.
I'm Jim Kutcher, and I had a question about the use of the term anti-Semitism, because a Semitic person is someone who speaks a Middle East language
Right,
like Hebrew or also like Arabic.
right.
So it's kind of meaningless for that. And it seems to me it covers up what you're fighting against. You're fighting against hatred of Jews.
That's right.
So why not just say that? And then it's a lot clearer what the fight is.
Yeah, I mean, Arabs are Semites too. You're absolutely right. I don't know when the word became specific to Jew hatred, but I think we would all agree that that's what it means today, in the current usage. But however, however you don't like it, I don't like it either. Yeah. I haven't looked into it. I honestly don't know when it was first used.
Thank you, Betsy. I am Betsy. And this is just a footnote to your off reference to the Harmony Club. In the 1970s, my stepfather, Eddie Appel, was the first non-Jewish
Seriously?
president of the Harmony Club. I'm sorry, non-German Jewish, thank you.
Jewish.
Non-German Jewish president of the Harmony Club, which then was all Jewish. And it was a big deal in the 1970s. So that was just my little footnote to your story.
I did some research on Lewis Marshall, who was a member of the Harmony Club. He was an attorney that doesn't ever get nearly as much credit as he should for his role in American Jewish history. And in the particular research I was doing, he was going after an anti-Semite who ran an exclusive club that kept Jews out.
On the other side of 60th Street.
No, upstate in Lake Placid. And I don't know if it ever occurred to him that the Harmony Club that he belonged to wasn't exactly welcoming of everybody. There were never official rules against taking, for example, Russian Jews, but you had to have references and there were all sorts of hurdles that you had to go through. And I never saw him comment on the fact that he was in some ways guilty of the same thing he was accusing others of.
Hi, I'm Stu. I'm wondering, given the book that you wrote, if you have any thoughts at all on what's going on in the Texas schools right now.
You mean the Ten Commandments?
Correct. Well, it's
Well,
more,
the chaplains and things like
more
that.
than that. It's reading Bible verses. The state just said Bible verses will be read
Yeah,
in public schools.
right. Well, I mean, I already outed myself when I said I don't know why Christmas is a legal holiday in this country. Obviously, I'm very upset about that. I'm upset about the case that we thought the Supreme Court was going to take up on the Ten Commandments, because they just did it in 1980. Same damn principle. And they said, no, it's not allowed in the public schools, period. But what's happening was, with this particular Supreme Court, the forces of Christian nationalism figured this is their very best shot to undo all of the liberal decisions that have been made since the 1960s. And that's what's happening. I don't trust them at all in any of these situations to do what the Constitution clearly, I think, sets out and what the founders set out. So the answer is I'm pretty upset about it all. But what can you do when all of the cards are stacked against this point of view at this point?
Issue is going to end up, sorry. I'm sure the Texas issue is going to end up at the Supreme Court too at some
I would
point.
rather that a federal appeals court struck it down and the Supreme Court never
Right.
took it up.
Well, that may be.
Tell you the
You're
truth.
right. Yeah, you're right.
Scott, your description of the modern way you conduct your research made me wonder two things. One, do you write anything contemporary where you actually talk to human beings?
I try not to. I figured that if you write about dead people, there's nobody to tell you got it wrong. But I have done that in some of my books. I have actually gotten to the point where I want to talk to somebody. But I prefer the turn of the 20th century. They're all dead. You work from the records. You don't really, it's not messy where you find people who tell you that you're absolutely wrong because they remember it.
I'll save my, well, I'll follow up. Do you know other writers and historians? And which are you?
I see myself much more as a writer than a historian. You know, I have no academic credentials. I have a master's degree in education. I'm not a PhD in history.
Right.
No university would have me on its faculty. And I'm fine with that. I mean, I came to this late in life. I was a businessman working in China, took early retirement and needed to do something. And I had studied history as an undergraduate, and I always liked writing. And I was in the PR business, and that's all you do is write. But you write for somebody else. You don't write for yourself. And so finally, I was 56, and I had the opportunity to write for whatever I wanted to write for my own byline. And so I started with Chinese American history because it was really an underserved area, and it was something I could actually bring something to the party on because I could read Chinese. But after 4 books on the Chinese Americans, I got tired of them. And Jewish Americans were beckoning as far as I was concerned.
My follow-up question was, do you think you are kind of the model of modern writers of historic events that have access to these extraordinary databases
Well,
and never leave home?
I don't like to think of myself that way, and I'll tell you why. I like what they call microhistory. I am happiest when I find an event or a subject or a person and I can drill down as far as I can get and get everything there is to know about it. And as a result, I have a real prejudice in favor of primary sources. I don't like reading a lot of secondary sources to figure out what was going on, which means I don't deal in the great realm of ideas. I deal in telling stories. And so I think there's room for that. And I leave that to the academics. And I see myself really more as a storyteller than as a historian. Can't be more honest than that, can you? Yeah.
While I'm going over to Roberta, I want to ask Alan, as a historian, do you have a comment on all this activity?
Poor Alan, he didn't even
As a historian, what do you think of it?
I think historians operate very much the same way that you operate, and that is the primary sources are everything.
Yeah.
And so to the extent that you can drill down and find those primary sources, you'll have a much richer account of the past. And at the end of the day, isn't that what we're all looking for? The most accurate account of the past that we can muster based on the sources that are available at any given time. I think that's what you're doing very, very successfully. That's what the rest of us are doing as well.
Thank you. Coming from you, that's high praise.
This is going to be small, not major. But when you were talking, and I was telling some of the people at my table, I remember in grade school, every day, they recited the Lord's Prayer. I didn't have to say it. I was excused from saying it, but I know it because I heard it every single day. They also had release time where
Yes.
they would take
Yes.
the kids and go to some church or something somewhere else where they would study whatever they would study. And again, I was excused from that. I didn't have to do that, me and the 2 other kids in my class. And we got to stay behind and clean the blackboards and the erasers and things like that. But one time they were going to do the Old Testament, they said. And they called or wrote my dad, I'm not sure what they did. And they said, oh, she can come now because this is what they're saying. He said, no, your Old Testament is different from my Old Testament, and she's still to be excused. But, I don't know how many of you all, went through similar experiences, but when you were talking about it, I said, wow, yeah, I remember that. Of course, the school had a Christmas tree and Oh, where I grew up in St. Joseph, Missouri.
Uh-huh. Roberta, the release time actually owes it started right in this period. And it was really the churches that were pushing for it. The Jews were divided about it. The churches, they really wanted a second bite at the apple. The Sundays wasn't good enough. Initially they wanted instruction in the schools in religion, but when that was found to not be acceptable, they decided that on Wednesday afternoons, the schools would teach not very important subjects. And if the parents wanted them to, they would go, but had to be off-site. They would go to a church, whatever church it was, and then they would get a couple of hours of religious instruction. Some of the rabbis were for it and some of them weren't. And the Jewish kids had the same rights and the same opportunities. They could go to a synagogue if they wanted to. It's still around. It still happens in a lot of schools. We don't hear so much about it in the East, but it definitely happens in the Midwest and some of the other areas. And the West.
Anybody on Zoom? Questions? Yes, just a moment.
This is just a brief comment. I mean, I grew up in the Boston area and I do remember saying the Lord's Prayer and it was mandatory.
Mm.
And then all of a sudden it stopped. That must have been
Yeah.
1962.
Right.
But the fact that this is a losing issue is probably true because if you go to the Supreme Court, you'll see one of the biggest Christmas trees you've ever seen. And
Right.
when I first saw that, just 20 years ago, I was really dismayed and disheartened by that.
We'll give you a sense of how radical I am on the issue. I was always appalled by the national Christmas tree behind the White House. I didn't think it belonged there. And when the Chabadniks decided that we were going to have a national menorah, I was equally mortified. I don't want any of them up there. It's not, and you can't make the argument that we are simply a Judeo-Christian country. What about the Muslims? What about Wiccan? What about some of the other, it's silly. It's wrong. But I would despair of getting any justice out of this Supreme Court. It's not going to happen.
Here we go.
There's a
Just a
microphone
minute.
coming your way.
I'm smiling because I grew up in the 1930s in the Pittsburgh public schools in my neighborhood, Squirrel Hill, which was quite Jewish.
Mhm.
And we'd love to sing the Christmas carols. And in my class, there was only, I think, one kid who wasn't Jewish. And we'd jump in and sing Silent
Yeah.
Night. And then when we got to the last line, suddenly we grew quiet. So we kind of joined in, but created our own protest at the end of the song. So,
And you got to admit, they've got better songs than we do. They really do. We have a little dreidel. Yeah, right. But mostly written by Jews, exactly. Irving Berlin in particular.
So if there are no more questions,
No, there is one or two.
What happened when they changed the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag and they included one nation under God? This
That was the 50s.
Yeah.
That was creeping communism was responsible for that.
Okay. Is
that
it
the-
still being done?
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
mean,
It's never
it's-
not done. I didn't say it. When I was in elementary school, I refused to say it. I just was quiet for those couple of words because
The-
I was an atheist and I wasn't going to do.
But the country was not supposed to have any religion,
Correct.
and they put under God
Yeah.
in it.
And you'll see an awful lot of stuff that the Christian nationalists are putting out, trying to contort the history into pretending that we are a Christian country. We've always been a Christian country. The founders were Christian, none of which is actually true if you look at the record. But this isn't about fact. This is really about politics. And it's not a good time for the good guys right now. It's just the way it is. But the reason that under God was put in was essentially to distinguish us from the godless communists like Russians. They didn't feel that kids were getting enough of a moral education in the United States. And that's also one of the reasons they wanted to inject more religion into the schools in the 50s. That's why Release Time happened back then as well.
well, thank you so
My
much.
pleasure.
That was wonderful.
It was fun.